Okay.
Don't
Um,
forget to start our recording,
I
right?
just
Please.
did.
Oh, you
So
did. Okay.
the chat recording was started. So if you're joining this and it's a video, please apologize for the introduction. But yes, welcome again to the March Community of Practice call for COVES, where we're looking at the difference between QR code responses and the staff survey responses. What's the difference? You have to do that in your best Jerry Seinfeld voice. I think that's going to make it really catch hold and make this a lasting impression. I'm going to get us kick-started here. So Mallory, if you could advance to the next slide. Here's what we're going to cover. I'm going to discuss some initial framing, so where the QR code initiated, why it began, and how it evolved into what you might be using it for your data collection practices today. Mallory's going to show us three anonymous case studies where each of those is an investigation into the differences in the methodology. So we're really just poking the data to see what we can learn. And then at the end of the call, we do have some recommendations and takeaways. I'll jump to the end, which is like it is complicated, but we do have recommendations and strong feelings about those recommendations. But before we share those, we're going to invite you all to react to some of the data and allow you to share your thoughts so we can try to co-create best practices for us all. Next slide, please. So, it's important to remember how COVES started before you even get to how QR codes came into being within the COVES methodology. As many of you, almost all of you, hopefully all of you know, we were IMLS funded several times. And during our second IMLS grant, in which we built the COVES system, we did a rigorous pilot study investigating how we sample visitors, both from a methodological perspective and from a group perspective. Is it an individual? Is it anyone in a group? Is it all of the people in the group? And this slide, hopefully you've seen at one point or another during perhaps one of your initial trainings on COVES, but this shows the difference between the three primary methods that we tested: an email survey, a survey that was read aloud as an interview protocol, and the staffed survey, which is done at Exit, like you now know and are probably using very frequently. As you can see in this graph, the proportion of perfect tens on the Net Promoter Score question, right? So that the highest possible score on the likelihood to recommend is significantly higher for both the email and the interview method, and therefore lower on the survey method. Now, 0 to 9 is a huge range, but what this shows you is that both the email and interview methods that we tested had some type of bias that was leading people to give overly positive responses, things that were not true in a more generalized sample. For the email method, this is likely due to sampling bias, which I'm going to talk about in another slide or two, meaning the people who choose to respond to the email survey are different in some way than the non-responding sample. And in the interview method, something you're probably all familiar with, which is social desirability bias, or this desire to impress upon the person you're talking to that everything is fine. I had a great time. Thank you for asking me face to face. It feels almost bad to say no or say something anything less than perfect to an individual at a museum. The survey was seen as the most honest method of collecting this visitor feedback. And yes, this is only one question. And yes, this is only three methods, but this was enough to give us data supporting evidence that the staffed survey at the exit was the most appropriate for what we are trying to do through COVES, which is, again, generalize to a broader audience as much as possible. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, everything changed. That is something we're all aware of, but specific to COVES, things had to change for a couple of different reasons. One, the questions we asked on the survey had to become a little bit more sensitive. For example, it was no longer appropriate to ask about household income if people were just laid off, right? How do I answer that question? It's 0 now. Yesterday, it was a very big number. Where am I supposed to put myself? When was the last time you came to the museum? I don't know. You've been closed for several months. How should I evaluate this question? So there were some obvious measurement pieces that we had to change. But specific to methodology, we made two big pivots. One was going back to the email method, which I just showed you we knew had flaws in. However, there was enough pressure at the time, which again, I think you were all aware of this. People didn't want to touch stuff. People were nervous about coming back. People were nervous about standing too close to another individual, whether or not they knew them, for fear of catching COVID. So because of these um, reasons, we introduced the QR code to facilitate social distancing and enhancing visitor comfort. Because we were almost perfectly able to say, I have 100% of the email addresses I need to include my entire visiting sample. We were also able to more reliably go back to the email method, but we knew that was a short-term solution to a longer issue that we would have to deal with. So for those of you who have been participating since pre-2020 and now, you remember we had about 2 years of email supported data collection, and then that ended in 2022. While email method ended, the QR code remained because we realized it was an incredibly important accessibility feature. So for visitors who still wanted to use their own device for any reason, but specifically for things like font magnification, screen reading technology, if they have a language translator installed on their thing that helped them navigate multiple survey forms, that was great. So we kept the QR code specifically for this accessibility reason. Next slide, please. Just reflecting on that COVID pivot that we did, comparing email responses to our known and trusted staff method. This is an analysis that Gretchen at SMM, and if you're on the call, thank you, Gretchen, presented for us in July of 2022, just after we officially ended our email policy. But we had a known bias in the email responses compared to the staff method. So if you look at the graph, the gray is the email. The blue on either side was before email staffed responses and after email staffed responses. And on the left, you can see that the email method introduced a bias where we saw a higher educated visitor, more women respondents, more members, and more groups with disability. On the right, you can see that there are some lower numbers, lower gray bars, fewer adult-only groups, fewer low-income households, fewer BIPOC or LGBTQ plus identifying respondents, and fewer first-time visitors. And these are enough biases to remind us that the email method has its flaws in who chooses to respond. Next slide, please. We also have one example of an extreme response bias in which the QR code was inappropriately used by simply leaving it out in an unstaffed manner, meaning you just put it up by the exit and anybody who walked by was able to scan the code and take the survey at their leisure. They were not randomly sampled. And there are two important parts here. One is the small sample total on the left for the unstaffed QR. People are unlikely to fill out this survey, period. I think the unstaffed was left up for about 9 or 10 months. And on the right, you see the staffed exit survey when this site was retrained and we started the normal or standardized methodology of the staffed exit survey. They collected more than 300 responses in less than 6 months. So the sample size jumped, and that's what we want. Secondly, the graph on the left has these big bars on the left and the right, the red and the green. People treat this type of unstaffed QR code as a digital comment card. They are much likely to have extremely negative or extremely positive responses. And they go out of their way to tell you about it. Whereas on the right, we see a pattern which, although admittedly very positive, is much more in line with what we see in the general trend of our COVES data. So we were able to collect more data in less time with this staffed method. Next slide, please. One of the reasons we're having this call today, where we talk about the difference between the QR code and the staffed, is the importance of standardization. So why COVES is important as a system in the first place. One, it gives confidence in the data, right? When you look at your COVES data, you should trust that they were collected accurately, that they are reliable, and that you can interpret them without too much caution, and that has caveats with it, mostly due to sample sizes. Two, that they're representative. Our random sampling procedure is intended to give you an unbiased view of your overall audience, even when you're collecting fewer than 1% or 5% of your total visitors, within a 3-month or 12-month period. And lastly, it's designed to be comparable and aggregatable, meaning the data are the same. You can push them together, you can take them apart because they are the same questions, the same response options collected in the same way. These three pieces are basically the foundation on which COVES is built, and we need to make sure we're paying attention to that. Next slide, please. All right, so this is kind of the end of my introduction to where we are now and why we're getting into the case study. So as you see the presentation of data that's to come, I want you to consider specifically these two questions in addition to anything else that jumps out at you. So when you're thinking about COVES and you're collecting data, what advantages or disadvantages do either the QR or the staffed method have? And when interpreting your data, and perhaps when you're interpreting these next few slides, what concerns might you have about either the QR or the staffed data? And I will turn it over to Mallory.
Thank you. So I'm going to walk through three sites that we took a look at their QR versus staffed survey data because though we have been able to do the unstaffed QR versus our typical staff methods sort of analysis, and we've been able to do an email versus our typical staff methods analysis, this will be the first time that we're running um, a comparison between these two specific methods for the purposes of COVES. So we found three sites who have been long-term COVES participants who have high percentages of QR respondents, 60%, 25%, and 32%. Two of them are from the Science Plus cohort, and one of them is from the Art Museums cohort. Down here at the bottom, I also just have the dates over which the data that I will be talking about today has been collected, as well as the number of cases for each site. So you can see that those things do vary, but all of the data is as recent as January 2025. So we have done as best a job as we can to keep things up to date. So I will get us started talking about age. So this is one of the strongest trends that you will probably see. This is true at all three of the sites that we have here. And I will tell you that it's probably true at your site too. This is a very consistent finding. Um, but as these graphs sort of demonstrate, younger participants take the QR survey more than older participants do. And older participants take the staff survey more than they take the QR survey. In some cases, we are really dropping very, very low in these upper age categories, like 55 to 64 and 65 plus on the QR survey. So the QR survey results are shown in the lighter bars on each graph, and the darker bars are the staffed. And you can see that the darker bars for the staff survey are fairly high across all of the age categories, but those lighter bars really drop off around age 55. So it's important to recognize that we are not collecting as much data from people over the age of 55 when we're collecting it via a QR survey. And this is done with our approved QR survey method. Um, yeah. The next finding that we wanted to share with you all was LGBTQ plus status. So we do ask participants whether they identify as LGBTQ plus or not. They can answer yes, no, or not said. There's also an option for not sure questioning, but since that tends to be the smallest category, it was dropped from this analysis. And the important sort of finding here is that at some sites, not all sites, more LGBTQ plus respondents respond more yeses are a higher proportion of yes respondents answer the QR survey compared to the staff survey. This might be due to comfort levels with answering sensitive demographic information in a survey. For the staff method, we have never ever recommended that you sit there and watch very carefully as they answer the survey. That would be super awkward and uncomfortable. But you are standing there while they take the survey, even if you're not watching. And that feeling of being perceived might be strong enough to affect people's comfort levels with how they answer a question, especially when compared to doing so on their own device, possibly even in their own home. So it's possible that that is one thing driving these results. Education level is also something that tends to be a little wibbly wobbly across the staffed and the QR survey. So at some sites, we're seeing that people respond with prefer not to say more often on the QR survey in response to this education question. This is a result that's actually flip-flopped a little bit from when we initially ran these analyses. Um, Education level can be a sensitive piece of demographic information, especially if you fall into what might be considered less socially desirable categories of education level, like not having a high school degree. It might be more uncomfortable to share that information in the same way that it might be uncomfortable to identify yourself as LGBTQ on the staffed survey when you feel a little bit more perceived. Obviously, that's not quite what's happening here because in this particular result, we're seeing that people are preferring not to say their educational level on the QR survey. So it's possible that there is something else happening that's driving these results. But At least one site, this is also pretty consistent across the staff in the QR survey. The third site here, Science Plus, has pretty matching bars across all levels of education that we analyzed. So this is a very unstable finding, but there does seem to be some differences in the way that people are responding. Something similar is happening with income level. Income level is I don't have to explain, I think, to most people, income level is a very sensitive piece of demographic information as well. And income level has historically been the question on COVES that has yielded the least actual data and the hugest percentages of prefer not to say or skipped questions. As you can see at some of these sites, up to 60% of respondents are not willing to disclose their income. That's not super surprising. Um, People don't like to say their income on these kinds of surveys. But there are some sites in this analysis where people will respond more often with prefer not to say on the QR survey as well, which is another result that has flip-flopped around a little bit as we've analyzed it over time at different sites. So for all the same reasons that education might be awkward in some ways to answer in one format or another, we're seeing that there might be formatting differences coming into play, affecting people's comfort levels in answering questions on income as well. One thing we also wanted to look at, anecdotally, for anyone who in this call who's done data collection, you might, or especially at Science Plus museums, you might be able to tell that um, oftentimes parents with kids will use their kids as sort of an excuse, it feels like, to say no to the COPE survey. They'll be like, oh my gosh, I have a screaming kid, I can't right now, or this kid's tired, I gotta get him home for a nap, things like that. So we wanted to look at whether that actually panned out because maybe those people are more likely to take the QR survey because they can't do it right now because of their screaming kid, but they could do it later. Um, but what we actually found is that groups with and without kids were equally likely to take either survey at every site we tested, at both the Science Plus sites and the art site. Um, there was no difference in whether or not you had kids and that affected um, your tendency to take either kind of survey. So that is important to know to sort of contextualize that anecdotal experience that I'm sure many of us have, is that that might not actually be as huge of a factor as we think it is. Another thing we looked at is the tendency for people to skip answering demographic questions. So as I brought up, so we asked for sensitive demographic information on the COVE survey, and people might have different levels of comfort answering those questions. Although we have prefer not to say options on a lot of those questions, we also allow participants to skip any question that they don't want to answer. They don't have to click prefer not to say, they don't have to click anything at all. And we wanted to see if it was more common to fully skip questions on one kind of survey versus the other. And what we found is that at one of our science sites and the art site that we looked at, it was actually more common to skip questions on that QR survey. Whether that's driven by that comfort level phenomenon or maybe some technological issues where people on their own devices are doing something differently, I can't say for sure, but we were seeing more skipped questions on the QR survey in certain places. And the last thing we looked at that we wanted to highlight in this call, this looks like the exact same slide, but I promise it's different, is straight live positive respondents. So at most sites, some of the sites, most sites, but it's three. What we found is that NPS and OER, which are our experience rating metrics, did tend to be higher on the QR survey. I don't have those results graphed here, but it is a finding that we found almost everywhere. And we specifically wanted to see if that was driven by people doing what we've dubbed straight lining. So you're presenting a list of statements and you have to select 0 to 10 to rate your agreement. And you're just like, I don't want to do this. 10's all the way down. Everything was great. And you're not really providing meaningful data in that sense. We wanted to see if that was more common on one kind of survey than another. And what we found is that in some places it is, specifically at one of our Science Plus sites, it was more common to straight line on that QR survey than on the staffed survey. So people taking the QR survey might be doing it faster and paying less attention and providing less meaningful data on those experience metrics that we do value so much as COVES. So to summarize, some key takeaways from all of this. Older participants are tending not to take the QR survey. Older participants are often less reliant on their devices or less comfortable using their devices. So they are taking the staff survey and often are not taking the QR survey, at least not as much as younger participants are. More participants identify as LGBTQ plus on that QR survey, as we saw, um, possibly driven by an increased comfort level in responding with that sensitive information on the QR survey if they're taking it outside of the museum. People have differing comfort levels in reporting their income and education levels on the QR survey compared to the staff survey. This results, like the direction keeps sort of changing when we run these analyses. But what's clear is that there is something going on where people are more comfortable or less comfortable providing that information in front of a staff member. It doesn't matter if a group has kids, they're just as likely to take the survey via either method. So even though anecdotally we might think that groups of kids are a lot more likely to take a survey that they could take while they're like in the car on their way home, we're not actually seeing that pan out. At some sites, participants get more demographic questions on that QR survey. And at some sites, participants are more positive on the QR survey. They're straightlining more and they're generally providing more positive NPS and OER ratings. But that's what we found at our 3 sites. Thank you if you are here and you know one of the sites is you. Thank you for allowing us to anonymize and use your data. We're super grateful. Happy to, you know me. Shoot me an email if you have questions about this still. But those are our 3 case studies, and we wanted to get reactions from you guys about what you think of this data, if this is bringing up any concerns for you at your site, or questions that you have about the QR process and why the QR data might look different if it does on anything in particular. Yeah, Brian, am I missing anything?
Not missing anything. If you can hide the slides for just a second, or stop sharing, I should say,
Yep.
to give more people the opportunity to jump in. Again, so questions, comments, reactions is what we're looking for right now based on the presentation of the data or your own use of QR at your site. Chris has posed a good question in the chat. And I saw he came off mute, so maybe he was gonna jump right
I
into
just
it.
wanted no, I just wanted to make sure you had seen it in the chat.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Ryan.
I see it. Well, I'm gonna let it sit for a second with myself, but also to see if others have reactions to it. I will say that following conversations with, again, these sites that we talked to in advance of this call, this type of question came up, right? Which is the right method? Which is the best method? And I want to acknowledge here that there's no right answer, but there are better methods suited for certain outcomes or certain needs, right? The QR code is incredibly effective at getting people to scan a PDF of a menu when there's no physical one around. The QR is incredibly effective at allowing people for individual touch points. If something's broken within your museum, it's like right here. I can see it and I can react to it. Random sampling has a different purpose. The staff face-to-face interaction we've always found to be important. There are different types of bias, as I already talked about, sampling bias, positive response bias. We see a little bit of like literally modality bias if people have one of these in their pocket or like using these. So the answer to your question is complicated, but after this conversation with the group, I will tell you what we are recommending, which I think will illuminate my
I,
answer a little bit better.
I would like to add to that it's hard to say which method is more accurate. If we're talking about accurate to like our goal in COVES is to capture a teeny tiny subset of what we believe to be your actual visiting audience. We want to represent all of the people who come to your museum by only talking to like just a couple. And in that sense, we don't know the features of, I mean, that's kind of the whole point, right? Of taking surveys from those teeny tiny couple is that we don't know what that giant, sort of big visitorship actually looks like. Um, but the best way to do it is to sort of sample randomly, random sampling. And the staffed method isn't perfectly random. We're not always randomly we're not, out there all day doing data collection at our sites. You might have more data from the weekends because you have more people on the weekends to staff that or whatever. Um, it's not perfectly random, but it's slightly more random than a QR code, which people have to sort of self-select to do later, because of some memorable aspect of their experience or something like that. Like it's a slightly less random, which usually is a sign in social sciences broadly that it's less representative of that bigger picture of your audience that we are hoping to capture.
And not to blah 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 from the Coves team too much, but one additional piece of information I think we had is that in the analysis that Mallory was referencing that Gretchen did for the poster talking about Coves in COVID time, was that she actually compared. There was at least a couple sites that never switched their methodology. They just stuck with the staffed the whole time, despite, pandemic things, and they didn't see the same type of change in audience. So their audience stayed more stable. Because we had the same question, like, well, maybe the pandemic audience has just changed and that this is an accurate representation of who they were. And we don't know within sight, but we at least had this sort of clue that at the site or sites that didn't switch, they didn't see that same shift. So nothing is for sure, but that's just another piece of information that was, guiding our thinking.
I have a little follow-up question. So I see how like having a QR by the door that anyone can scan is less randomized. But if we're still approaching people, um, and then giving them the option for the QR, isn't it still the same amount of randomization? Because we're not just letting anyone use it.
Yeah, but you don't know at that point. They could scan the QR and then never ever take it and like close the tab, and they were just doing it to get out of the interaction, stuff like that. Like you don't, not all of the QR scans turn into QR surveys. Uh, and sort of the methodology that people undergo in the process, like the scans are about as random as, a staff survey, right? In some ways, older participants aren't gonna scan the QR as often, but it's about as random. But there's an extra step where we have to go from scanning the QR code to actually taking that survey, and we don't have, you know, control or even a good sense of what's happening, driving people's decisions in between those two steps. And so it's less random in that way, because there clearly, is something driving that decision, based on the findings that we have. I do also want to verbally recognize Elisa's comment in the chat. Um, is there a bias of who completes the survey based on their experience? Because people having a poor experience are less likely to, take the time to take that survey at the end of their visit and help us out. Probably, I would say. If you look at your site's measures of OER and NPS, they're going to be pretty high, probably, if you think of them in a sort of objective sense. Um, a lot of people are selecting excellent and outstanding. A lot of people are selecting 8, 9s, 10s for their experience. Um, it wouldn't surprise me if that was sort of from this kind of bias, but the QR doesn't necessarily negate that kind of bias, I think, as a method. I don't know, Ryan, Alice, and Alex, do you have additional thoughts on that?
The only thing that I can think of right now, because that's a tough question to answer, right? I don't think we have data that can really refute that as a suggestion, except in the case of the unstaffed QR that we looked at earlier. So people who have negative experiences are clearly willing to give feedback, and I think we've all experienced that in one way or another. The question you're really asking is through our random sampling, are they comfortable giving that feedback in that moment, or are they escalating it to a different place, whether it's an online review or an actual comment card or talking to someone, and therefore avoiding the survey itself? And again, I don't know that we have data that can really address that question. So it's a good one to keep in mind. I'll put it back on you. Do you think that's happening?
Not sure. I've it's it's something I do wonder, just because I'm often the one doing the data collection, so I'm having those interactions. And every once in a while you get the person who says, "Oh, you don't want my feedback," and they're ready to walk out the door. And it's like, no, it's okay. No, then they're gone. Um, it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And while we were one of the sites that never switched to email coves, we did for a time do parallel regular coves and a separate email survey. I was only able to do that for a short period of time because those who don't know, St. Louis Science Center is free. So I do not have a way to consistently get emails from everyone who walks in the door. But during that brief period of time where they were overlapping, the NPS that was coming on our email surveys was markedly lower than the NPS that was coming via COVES with the staff survey. And so I think it was just that we were hitting that broader spectrum of range of experiences. And because people weren't tasked with doing it as they're walking out the door, we were maybe getting a broader range of experiences represented. I don't recall off the top of my head all the demographic comparisons between those samples, but it was when I tried presenting that internally, it caused enough confusion and consternation that my explanations of the different methodologies wasn't helping. And so I just said, we're just going to stick with the consistent. We use COVES. This is our NPS. This is the one we do. And our experience may be unique just because of the free thing. But yeah, it's a question I get. This it's so positive. Nobody's having a bad time.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Elisa. And I recall some of our conversations, like using the COVID data is tricky too, because things were different then, right? Um, and I remember we theorized that members would be the first to return. And we saw that pan out in our attendance data, or a lot of the attendance data that I looked at. But we also saw that members, for the first time ever, may have had a more negative experience than non-members because they were used to certain things being open, things done a certain way, or they wanted their environments in a certain way. So the data were tricky to piece out. I'm guessing, or I would be confident that in that email sample, you probably had a higher proportion of people like repeat visitors or members or and those are the audiences that I'm trying to use in this example to say, like, is there an explanation there? But you know, the short story here is we're trying to find allowances for all of us that give us the most robust method of collecting data that we trust. Again, things that we have confidence in, things that allow us to compare and aggregate. Um, and that's the
Things that
piece that.
balance a demand for, staff labor. An
Mhm.
interview is a very in-depth process, and email requires no front of house staff to do pretty much anything at all. We want to land somewhere in the middle, right? To sort of best balance, the information we can get with the amount of labor that we know that it takes from each site.
Well, an email isn't labor free because what we saw
It's not labor free, but
took more time to get to a completed survey. Yes, you might get more yeses of the actual email itself, but then that gave you fewer completed surveys at the end. So you had to weigh up your asking time to get a comparable amount of surveys.
yeah, I guess I'm thinking about it and the automatically sending a survey to the email of every person who paid for tickets that are ticketing this kind of method, which is definitely less labor intensive. But yeah, sending there and collecting the emails is still labor. And like you said, Allison, it takes actually longer to get the same amount of surveys.
Yeah. And I know during the pandemic, it was because of contact tracing, way more sites just had everyone needs to give their email. And I think many sites have backed away from that. So we don't have as a consistent source of emails the way we did when everyone was very concerned about contact tracing.
There's a really good chat going on about staffing data collectors in general, which I encourage everyone to check out. It's not worth me reading, but this is always a question. Who does it and how do we keep them and how do we encourage them? Any other thoughts or comments about the data or this kind of conundrum between the QR and the staffed?
I have a question. I was wondering, I know I'm dark right now because I just turned my phone on, it'll come back. I was wondering if these analysis, if there's anything you would suggest for sites to look at within our own data, like do you have any advice around like an action we should take at looking at our own dashboards?
That's a great question. Thanks. And I think that was posed a little bit earlier about how to do that. And the answer is everyone should have a filter on your dashboard for the method because we do track QR and staff. That's obviously how we ran these analyses. So you can poke your own data and see if that's going on for you. I encourage you to look at those high-level ratings, NPS and OER. Are you seeing a difference? And then again, look at some sensitive demographic questions. Obviously, this is not causal, right? If it was, if we were able to just say like, oh, the method is causing X, Y, or Z to be different, there would be a much more straightforward answer for us. But what we're trying to do is make sure that the data that you look at in your COVES dashboard is representative of your audience and therefore can be trusted. And for many of you, so I will,
Best of our ability.
yeah, I will jump to, in fact, maybe we can, so why don't we share the next couple slides? And then we'll revisit this whole group conversation for, again, reactions and or comments. So our recommendations based on this analysis and conversations we've had with you and with ourselves and with other experts is that the QR code was designed and should continue to be used as an accessibility tool. And that is the primary, if not only, designation for which we encourage its use. If you have been in the habit of saying like, oh, you don't have to take the survey now, you can take it later, as kind of this like letting the visitors off the hook because you feel like you're burdening them, we don't recommend using a QR code as an option for visitors who are short on time. We are doubling down on this importance of the uniformity of methods across sites. Again, if in order for COVES to be successful as a system, we need to have standardization in place. So because of that need, here are our guidelines for all of you. So Julie, this kind of piggybacks on your question because you can look at your sample sizes, if nothing else. If you're seeing QR responses less than 10% of your total sample, keep doing what you're doing. 0% is fine, 9.9% is fine. 1 out of every 10 surveys coming through on the QR for any reason, we don't see as being a detriment to a lot of those things we talked about before, our ability to aggregate, your confidence in the data, et cetera. If you're seeing responses 10 to 33% of your sample coming from QR, we encourage you to reevaluate your practice. What are you doing that's leading to those higher QR responses? Can we address any of them? What is this bringing up for you both in your data collection practices or your interpretation of the data? If you collect responses that exceed 33% of your overall sample from QR, we will exclude your institution's data from our aggregate reporting because that's the point at which we feel we lose confidence in our standardization. And if you are one of those sites that has anywhere between 50 or 100%, it implies to us that it's actually you're not following the COVES standardized data collection method that has been trained with all sites. The reason I wanted to share this is to talk about the entire COVES community. Right now, we've got roughly 120 museums collecting COVES data, which is amazing. Of that 120, 67%, so exactly 2/3, are in that 0 to 10% range. So 2/3 of our sites, like this is a moot point essentially. 16% of our sites are above 50%. So that's the problem area that we're finding. It's like it's not people in the middle. Most of our sites, like the QR code, is not an issue. It's there as an accessibility feature. Some people take it. That's great. A couple sites are relying on it exclusively, and that's what we're trying to move away from. There are very few sites, 13%, that are in that 10 to 33% range. So again, it seems to be kind of an all or nothing battle, which is why we wanted to analyze the data to see how problematic this was, regardless of, its distribution across sites. If you can move forward one more slide, Mallory, and then we'll go back to whole group conversation. This is our recommendation for you as data collection managers, as data collectors, or as people who are using the data and thinking about how this can be impacting your ability to use the dashboard or access your data. We encourage you to modify your approach script. So the QR code is an accessibility tool. The problem is if we don't let visitors know that it exists, even visitors who need those accommodations may not be taking advantage of it. So many data collectors start with, hello, my name is Ryan. I work here at the museum. We're seeking feedback. If you'd be willing to take a survey, the survey is anonymous. It takes about 5 minutes. You can skip any questions you'd like. Please get started. We encourage adding this additional line of, if you'd be more comfortable taking it on your own device, let us know. This suggests that we have an accommodation that people can take advantage of without putting them on the spot to diagnose that it is a disability for which they need an accommodation or anything else. But again, you're reminding them that we have an accommodation in place. It's also not pushing the QR to people in a way that kind of supplants the staffed or traditional method that we call the staffed method. And we just want to remind people that, no's are acceptable. Get comfortable with them is, it's better if we get yeses, obviously, but there's no penalty for a bad day of data collection. There's no way to control for visitors' likelihood to respond to the survey. And the QR code actually doesn't necessarily present an out. Even if they scan it, we don't have confidence that they take it. Based on our tracking ability, we have a huge range in what the QR completion rate is. I'm looking at some now, and some of our QR completion rate calculations show more than a 260% response rate to QRs, which is another way of saying that collectively we don't track it well enough to actually understand the return on each QR scan. So we want to encourage people to use the staffed method. We want to encourage people to introduce the QR, this, if you'd be more comfortable taking it on your own device, let me know. But we do want to limit the amount of QR because we see enough differences in the data that it suggests a sampling bias. And with that, I think we can close stop sharing the slides and again, open it back up to conversation or additional comments from the COVES team.
I had a follow-up. I saw the chat about like how to set the QR data to actually see on your dashboard how many responses you have for each. I personally can't find that on my dashboard, and so that could be the case for others as well. You mentioned that in your response, so I just kind of wanted to say that out loud. If you on your dashboard can't find how many QR versus staffed responses you have, like me, maybe that's something that you all can fix, or even
can
if
you find the filter, Julie?
I can't even like find a new filter to add it. I don't know the name of the variable. Like,
Okay.
I can do it. Maybe you want to just show it right here. If this is the advice, like go to your dashboard and look at this. Can you show us how to do that? Because I would have thought I could figure it out, and now I feel a little sad that I'm going to share that. I'm going to share my sadness with all of you.
Should with like six asterisks behind it should be at the bottom where it says there should be a widget that says staff and QR, recognizing that there clearly isn't on your dashboard, and I will go fix that after this meeting.
It could just be mine's an old one, y'all. I'm probably the weirdest one on this call.
But if you are in the same place, either send us a message now or send us an email at coves@mos.org, so we don't forget to take care of it. Send us an email and we'll make sure it's on there because it should be, and that's something where we've just overlooked it or missed it at some point.
If anyone looks at their raw data, it is in there. And so I've looked at this before using the raw data with the variable named like QR, and you can see percentage. It's useful there, but I know the dashboard is like, I use it on a day-to-day basis in a much quicker way. And so knowing that it should be at the very bottom is good to know.
Can you guys show us how to use it on a normal dashboard, like one that is functioning, like real quick?
Yeah, I can pull up so I have the Museum of Science dashboard open. Are my Museum of Science people okay if I just share the very bottom without any sensitive information, or is
Share the
that
sensitive information. Give them my
I
social
will not.
security number.
So this is what my
Don't be
view
sensitive.
of the dashboard looks like. So this is my Museum of Science dashboard. So this is the widget that Allison was talking about here at the very, like you can see I've scrolled all the way down to the bottom. And it's showing me there's a date filter on the Museum of Science dashboard right now. So this is only the 2024 calendar year. But it shows me I have, 1,157 surveys in the staffed method and 68 in the QR method. I could change that anytime I wanted. And also, if you go up here to the top, this bar along the top is filters, and method is the filter in question here. And you can see you can ignore all these no data ones, which are holdovers from older methods like the email. But we have the QR and the staff. So if I only wanted to look at QR data, I would check QR, and you can see it's gotten rid of those 1,000 something surveys that were in the staff, and it's only showing me QR. And I can look at all of my other data, which the Museum of Science has a lot because we're sort of the first site. But you can see all of these widgets, and then I could switch it to staffed and not QR and see them change.
Yeah, I think it's
So,
clearly not, Ryan. I think maybe it was a standard thing we had for a while, or maybe there was an issue with which dashboard was being sort of replicated to create new ones. So clearly it's not as standardized maybe as we intended for it to be or we hoped. So I think that's something we can go back and review and make sure that everybody has access to it in an easy way.
yeah,
Thank you
if
so
you're not
much.
seeing the widget or you're not seeing the filter on your dashboard, shoot us an email. We will go through on our own, but if you're like if you know that you are one of the sites that we're gonna eventually hopefully find and fix, let us know. That would be super helpful. And we will get it fixed for you even faster.
Yeah, I'm seeing some have it and some don't. So if you're in that I don't have it boat, just let us know and we'll make sure to fix it for you.
And right now in the chat, I'm sharing, hopefully all of you are aware of our YouTube channel, which is where we post these calls if they're recorded. A number of years ago, Alex made a bunch of helpful dashboard how-tos. So I put that playlist link in the chat. The look and feel of the Qualtrics dashboard has changed over time, but the functionality is almost exactly the same. There are a couple that I'm looking at now, which is applying filters, filtering overview, date filtering, filtering final thoughts. That might enable you to create your own custom filters, or if in the case that you're not seeing this one, be able to add it yourself. But again, as we just kind of acknowledged, if you don't see it, let us know. We will fix it. And again, poke your data. So, Chris, to answer your question from the get-go, my gut is telling me that people, and this is not uniformly true, which is why it's really hard to have this kind of conversation across 120 sites collecting data. But at some sites, the people who scan the QR code are trying to appease the data collector face to face, doing what is asked of them, social desirability bias, and then are unlikely to complete the survey on their own, unless some other characteristic is drawing that survey, compelling them to complete the survey. As we have seen in the email method, and we're starting to see in some of the QR analyses, my gut, and informed by the data, but like it's people who have an affiliation with the museum beyond just they were asked to complete the survey. So it's kind of like the email respondent sample or respondent bias in that way. I've got a relationship, I'm a member, I'm going to give, I'm more likely to complete it, or I had a really good experience and therefore I should do it. It's the meh people that I'm worried about. If you had a bad time, I mean, I can't address Elisa's question. I think they might be avoiding giving feedback. I would hope not, because if I had a bad experience, I'd want to tell someone. But I'm wary of getting into this comment card mentality, or like we're only attracting people who are incentivized in some way through their relationship with the museum to fill out the form, which is why the randomization of the staffed method is important to me and to our methodology. And I do believe that that presents the least biased of all possible methods that we have considered, even if it is still flawed in some ways. And I will add one final thing about this whole like negative experience thing, which I talked about just yesterday with some other nerdy people, which is recency bias. So if you are allowing visitors to complete an experience-based survey when they're still in that experience and it is fresh in their mind, that is actually really good. If you allow them to get stuck in traffic outside the Museum of Science because McGrath Highway is under construction and it is a terrible place to drive, and then 2 days later they're reflecting on their experience and that's the last thing they remember, that is not so great. So you want to keep in mind when people are giving you information, their demographics are unlikely to change, right? So there's clearly some differential in the sample, but their experience is what's worrisome to me. So I encourage us all to keep that in mind. And again, so we are not going to police data collection practices across sites, but we want to ensure when you look at the aggregate that you've got confidence there too. It's not just in your own data, it's in everybody's data. We publish this stuff as if there are no problems with it. We don't have enough room in our aggregate reports to put all the caveats that probably should be there. But people take this information very seriously. So it's important for us to maintain that level of rigor with our methods and encourage you all to do the same. And the one thing that we will commit to is if you have a very high proportion of QR responses exceeding 1 out of every 3 surveys, we'll just remove those institutions from our aggregate analysis. So thank you all. The chat is great. We can share these slides, but before we end, I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Yes, I just wanted to share with the Coves community. This hasn't actually happened with our team yet, but I am leaving the Coves team and the Museum of Science, but I'm not going, well, I'm going far in one sense and not far in another sense. I'm going to go to SMM, Science Museum of Minnesota, to be in their research and evaluation department. So I'm moving very far, but you can't get rid of me on these COP calls, at least, or having my hands in the Coves community. So I'll be managing the data collector type staff at Science Museum of Minnesota. So I'm really excited, really sad, but happy that I don't have to leave all of you. But I just wanted you all to know that as we end the COP call today. So I won't be answering your emails anymore, unfortunately.
No, I was going to say the
But
opposite. If you guys have
oh,
grievances about Coves, email Alex today. It's the best chance to get
mhm.
everything off your chest and just tell us how you really feel. There's still some good comments coming through in the chat, so I don't want to cut that off, but I just do want to acknowledge from our Coves team, we are incredibly sad to lose Alex. We're incredibly excited that we're not going to lose him in the community. But for those of you who have been involved in Coves for years and years, you know how much Alex has done. He cannot be replaced. We're going to miss him dearly. So let's all wish him well on his journey to Minnesota and excited that we get to see him on future calls. Yes, welcome back to the Midwest. With that said, I want to thank you all. Again, if you have questions on this, just email the Coves team. This is, we still have a lot to learn, but I'm appreciative of your time. Thank you all so much for engaging with us, and we will see you next month. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Everyone.
All right, bye.